far back as I can remember. My brother John, my real father, and my real mother, Marlene, we lived in Michigan. I was about 3, 4 years old. My father went to war. He came back and he just wasn't right. He couldn't get his life back to normal. He was drinking, doing all kinds of things that you're not supposed to do around kids. So my mom, Marlene, decided to leave my father and move to Florida. It had to be tough on her. She was making this big decision to be a single parent with 2 young boys. She wanted us to grow up proper, and she was dedicated to us. She was a beautiful woman. She was inside and out. I mean, I can't say enough about her. She was always loving and caring. She was inspiring. Months passed, and she met Mike Warren, and he seemed like a nice guy. He was charming, he was flattering, he said the right things at the right time. He'd go out his way to do something, for someone. He seemed real nice. He seemed real knowledgeable, just a nice guy. So they got married. My mom was content. We were striving as a family. Things were going pretty good. I mean, life was good.
Marlene was a great mom who took pride in everything that she did, and I think that was exemplified by the life that she lived. She was successful. Marlene owned properties. She was essentially a landlord, and her husband, Mike, repossessed cars. They were a busy family. From the outside, it looked like success.
Mike bought a piece of property out in the Aero Club in Wellington because he was flying airplanes.
The people who lived there parked their airplanes in the backyard. We're talking about wealthy people. You'd be lucky to live here. The American dream.
Wellington has this name for excellence, perfection, and it held its name for being a nice area to grow up in. It was something out of a fairy tale book. Everything was just immaculate. I can remember that day. It was around lunchtime. I was at work. My boss told me to go home. As soon as my mother saw me, she started crying and said, "Your brother's dead. He died in a car accident." I don't know how to tell you. I'm just gonna tell you. And I lost all energy in my body. I just went limp. I just was in disbelief. We were just devastated. After my brother's death, my mom, she started reaching out, needing Mike more, and asking for him to be around. and he was not around when he was asked to be around. She asked him to hire someone and to do what he needs to do to be home. And 6 months later, it didn't happen. Nothing changed. He wasn't home. The same old stuff, just different day. Eventually, she started catching on that something was wrong. He'd come up with excuses. I have to go do this, I have to do that, I have to repo cars. He had an excuse for everything as well. Excuse, not an answer. I remember that morning, my door opened up and I saw Mike's face look in. Nothing was said. He shut the door and left. I had some friends over my house, and somewhere around 10 o'clock or so, we were eating our breakfast, and my friend Gene says, somebody's at the front door. We all look, and we can see the colors through the door. It looked like a person had some flowers. Gene was going to go answer the door. My mom said, no, sit down. Finish your breakfast, I'll go get the door. My mom went and answered the door. And we heard, oh, how pretty. And then I saw my mom fall to the ground. I looked down and saw that something was desperately wrong. I jumped up, I went to the front door, I looked out, and then I saw the clown. I was shocked. There was makeup on and there was colorful costume. I knew I needed to identify this person somehow. But it was impossible. I mean, the only thing I saw visible was the eyes. I saw big brown eyes. I couldn't say if it was a male or female. What really stuck out to me was the boots and the orange wig. I mean, I was trying to see whatever I could possibly see.
Joey Aarons and his girlfriend made their way to a car to be able to try to chase the clown.
The perpetrator drove off in a white LeBaron. I was so reckless, I could have killed us and someone else trying to get this car down. I never driven like that before in my life.
I was the copy editor at the Palm Beach Post when the call came through that there was a shooting at a house in Wellington, and everyone rushed to the house. In the meantime, there were a couple neighbors who had heard gunshots. One was a doctor, and he and his neighbor rushed over and started treating Marlene.
I went back home, and my mom was already in the ambulance. They told me they had her secure. She was okay. Detectives were there, roaming through the house, a cop in every corner, in every room.
Police took photographs of everything. The blood stain in the entryway, the flowers that were still left behind, the balloons that were still left behind. Kind of right next to this pool of blood, very eerie, very sinister.
They individually interviewed the kids in the house, and each of their descriptions varied slightly. Most of them described that it was a white-faced clown with a red nose, so you had limited bits and pieces.
Usually you have a description of a male, female, but here was a clown who had dark eyes, and that's about it.
It's just so frustrating to not be able to give them any answers to go on. Looking back at it, not one thing was clear. It was all a mystery.
Breaking news, someone dressed as a clown shot a Wellington mother as she simply answered her front door.
When this happened, it shocked the entire community. And the search was on for this mysterious evil clown.
It was such a bizarre case that did grab everyone's attention, locally, nationally, internationally.
That shooter, a clown carrying flowers and balloons.
Marlene Warren had just answered her door, greeted by a clown.
And the whole specter of this person being dressed like a clown added this media frenzy about it.
Someone dressed as a clown came to the door with 2 balloons and a basket of flowers.
Clowns became very scary for people. There is something creepy about clowns. It was frightening.
Florida's known for kind of crazy crimes. And even by Florida standards, this one just blows it out of the water. Killer clowns are something you see on TV and in horror movies, not in real life.
She was on a respirator, a breathing machine. I stayed with her, and I didn't get any response. No movement, no eye movement, nothing. I just prayed and, told her not to leave me. I needed her.
In the emergency room, Marlene Warren struggled to stay alive. The bullet had entered her mouth and traveled back to the spine, and it actually damaged her spinal cord and her ability to breathe on her own.
The first day was still a lot of hope. The second day there was a lot of hope, but it started fading. On the third day, my grandmother said that, we're gonna have to let her go. That was pretty hard. That was really hard. I could feel it in my heart and my soul just get ripped out of me. When I looked down at her, and I knew my whole heart and my soul it left me.
Marlene suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and when she passed, the investigation changed from an attempted murder investigation to murder.
Marlene Warren died after being shot in the face by a clown who came to her door bearing flowers and balloons.
The detectives did ask Michael Warren if he had any ideas about who would have done this, what motive they might have had.
Michael, who apparently was rattled, told police that the person who committed this could have been perhaps a disgruntled tenant because Marlene was a landlord.
When the detective spoke to all the people that knew Marlene Warren, to a man, to a person, everyone said nothing but the most glowing things about her.
We met tenants in the apartments that she managed who described her as more than a landlord, but a member of their families.
They couldn't find anybody that didn't like her or had any disagreement with her. So it pretty quickly became apparent that the only person that really had a motive was Michael Warren.
I think that people who were close to Marlene believed that Michael was having an affair, cheating on Marlene with one of his employees. The potential for a divorce would have been a devastating one financially for Michael. If Marlene had decided to leave that marriage because of what he was doing, she would have gotten the money. She would have gotten the properties because they were in her name.
You're listening to Mike Miller on...
We're talking about the death of Marlene Warren, the 26th of 1990. Somebody shot her wearing a clown outfit and left the home. Michael Warren with us. Mr. Warren, do you know anything about the shooting of your wife?
I do not know any more than what my son has told me at the time that he was at the house.
Do you suspect anyone in particular as being the person dressed in the clown that day who came to the house and killed your wife?
No, I really don't. It's been a tragic thing, and it's been like living in hell.
The investigators of this case had made no secret whatsoever, and if not formal allegations, certainly insinuations that Michael Warren was involved in the murder of his wife.
Well, I believe that if the sheriff's department can make accusations and comments without any proof or anything to back it up and bring me to trial by the media, I feel like I should say something that at least fight back.
Even though the motive for the killing seemed to be coming into view, there was nothing to tie Michael Warren directly to it. In law enforcement, when someone gets murdered, you immediately look to a spouse. But here you had Michael, who wasn't anywhere near the house at the time of the shooting. In fact, he was in a car with his friends on the way to a horse track. So he had an airtight alibi.
Soon after Marlene was shot, the police received a tip.
I'm afraid to say this. I think you just need to Sheila Keene, if you question.
A caller who said, check on Sheila Keene. Sheila Keene was a girl from the Glades. A lot of people knew her. She was a girl with long brown hair, these deep chocolate eyes. She worked with Michael repossessing cars. They were close, they did business together, and as time went on, their coworkers said that they were very affectionate with one another.
It became pretty apparent very quickly that Sheila Keene was very much involved with Michael Warren, and it was more than business.
Even by Florida standards, this case is bizarre. You have essentially the execution of a mother, not someone with mafia ties, not a woman with enemies, killed by a clown.
Although it was obvious to everyone that Michael was cheating on Marlene behind her back with Sheila Keene, there was no evidence that Michael participated in the murder. So police were focused now on Sheila Keene. They had the flowers and the balloons, and they went back and searched every local flower store to find out who sold these flowers and who sold the balloon.
Pretty quickly, detectives were able to locate a nearby Publix that in fact sold that very style of an arrangement.
When police went to the Publix, the employees who sold those balloons said that they remembered a tall woman with long brown hair buying them.
They next then were able to locate a nearby costume shop that was called Capizio. So they were able to speak to a couple of the ladies that worked at Spotlight Capizio who reported that on Thursday night, the 24th of May, that a female had come to the door after they were closed and was insistently knocking on the door to get them to open up.
They let her in. They described this woman as having long brown hair, brown eyes, kind of a mannish sort of mannerisms.
This was 2 days before the murder. And while inside, this woman asked for a clown costume and extra white makeup, but was not interested in buying shoes.
The clown who showed up at Marlene's door and pulled the trigger wasn't wearing clown shoes either. Joe and his friends said that the clown was wearing combat boots.
So detectives recognized immediately that Sheila Keene matched the description both of the ladies at the Publix and the ladies at Spotlight Capizio.
Police tell the employees to look through a police lineup for the person they sold that costume to, and Sheila's photo is in there. Neither is 100% sure that that's the woman who bought the costume.
Within about a week or two of the shooting, a white Chrysler LeBaron was reported to be abandoned in a nearby shopping center. So deputies responded, and when they find this white Chrysler LeBaron, which has the VIN number of a car, that had been reported stolen.
Not only was it stolen, it was stolen by Michael Warren's car lot.
Michael owned a company called A Bargain Motors, and their advertisements looked like a competitor car rental company called Payless. The clown drove away in a white Chrysler LeBaron. It was one that a couple had dropped off at A Bargain Motors, mistakenly believing that they were at Payless. Instead of correcting the problem and returning the car to Payless, Michael and his employees kept it.
They processed the car. There was a Publix plastic bag in the car and some fibers.
There are these reddish-orange fibers, consistent with what you might find in a clown wig. They also find long brown hair. Technology was not what it is today, and they weren't able to forensically analyze it.
The car itself didn't really lend evidentiary value except for the connection to Bargain Motors and Michael Warren.
Sheila Keene wasn't repo agent for Michael Warren. She was at the car lot a whole lot.
They brought Sheila Keene in for interviewing and asked her, where were you on May 26th?
You remember that far back Saturday morning where you were or what you were doing?
I got dressed, went to Waymont.
What time was it when you left your house?
I don't know, I'd say somewhere, 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock, something like that.
Did you find that car?
No,
Did you talk to anybody down there?
No.
Just drove by?
Yeah.
What kind of car were you looking for in Point?
Oh, God. I don't know, I think it was a Datsun, Nissan, Toyota, something like that. I don't
You know the location of which street in Point?
I think it's north something, 13th and 14th, I don't know.
She told police that at the time of the shooting, she was out repossessing cars, but she couldn't really give any kind of definitive address.
She was unable to provide them with a single person that she spoke to.
You couldn't have been driven by this passion because of this relationship that you and Mike. So,
There is no relationship. There is no passion.
She adamantly denied being in a romantic relationship with Michael Warren.
what would happen if that was your car?
I don't know how I got there because I wasn't in the car.
She claimed that her hair in the car could have come from anybody.
We're getting nowhere because I'm telling you I didn't do it. So whoever wants you to think that I done it, you need to find out who that person is.
She denied killing Marlene, and police didn't have anything that could prove otherwise at that time. Conclusively link Sheila to the murder.
I remember after they questioned her, she left town. She was gone, you know. And I'm going, oh my goodness.
Sheila Keene thought she got away with it. But although the case went cold, didn't mean it was over. This is still all about Marlene Warren. We want to do justice for her.
So as the homicide investigation continued, Michael Warren and Sheila Keene as individuals became in the background. Nobody really knew where they were or cared where they were or followed up on them.
The case started to go cold. You had a circumstantial case without a lot of direct evidence. There wasn't enough for prosecutors and police to decide to make a charge. And so this case grew colder by the day.
I had to say to myself, they're never going to find out who did this. My thought of the whole thing was, I gotta let this go. It's killing me. It's ruining my life.
One of the reporters at the Palm Beach Post was revisiting the case. One of our brilliant researchers went, "Oh, they're married."
Michael Warren and Sheila Keene had gotten married, and that started a whole new interest of AHA.
They moved to Virginia. Sheila changes her name to Debbie, dyed her hair blonde. They open a fast food restaurant. Have a happy life for years. They would invite their neighbors over for dinner and have dinner parties, and they were likable. They were a couple who seemed good and normal. Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office got a grant to re-examine old cases, and they chose this clown murder case. I think the reason they did might have been because of its allure and just how sensational it was.
Marlene Warren died after being shot in the face by a clown.
That shooter, a clown, carrying flowers and balloons.
Marlene Warren had just entered her door, greeted by a clown.
It was a huge murder. It was a shocking murder. I don't think it ever went out of the minds of law enforcement. And then I think the learning that they were married compelled them even more.
I found out that they opened up the case again. I mean, I was crying, but happy tears. I've never had that feeling before. You know, it was really wild.
a new detective took over the case, and she started to go through these decades-old bags of evidence, and she found among them a 6 to 8 inch fiber attached to one of the balloons left at the scene of Marlene's murder. And she got it analyzed. And that fiber matched the fiber found in the getaway car, and it also matched fiber found in Sheila's house. So here's the first definite connection, putting Sheila at the scene.
Back in 1990, they didn't have DNA technology like we have today. In 2014, new DNA technology came back with a hit from the strand of hair that was in the car that showed that the DNA in the car matched a mixture of Sheila Keene Warren and another person.
It was a wow moment. Finally, police had a scientific connection between the hair and Sheila Keene.
There was a meeting with the state attorney's office, and the decision was made to make the arrest of Sheila Keene for the murder of Marlene Warren.
We were determined to do justice. We wanted her to be held accountable for her evil actions. She was the evil clown, and her day was coming.
Breaking news, new documents shed light on a clown killer mystery and how investigators tracked down the suspect hundreds of miles away.
This was the news that people had been waiting for years, and the announcement of her arrest just reignited that sensation and this whole entire story.
They were watching them up at their home in Virginia, and they wanted to make the arrest away from the house.
So we worked with law enforcement to set up a checkpoint. And when she was driving, they pulled her over. And told her she was under arrest.
Sheila Keene didn't say, "What am I getting arrested for?"
She only had one question for law enforcement: if her husband was going to be arrested too. Once Sheila Keene Warren was arrested, she was brought back to Palm Beach County to face justice.
After 27 years, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office says it has cracked the Wellington killer clown cold case. Last night in Virginia, detectives arrested Sheila Keene Warren, who was the victim's husband's mistress.
I saw a bunch of pictures of her. That picture were the same eyes as the day that she killed my mother. Those eyes, when she got arrested, were all beady and looking exactly like that day. You know, I saw the eyes, and the eyes don't lie.
See if you could answer some questions that really weren't ever answered back then.
I didn't do it, so that's the end of the story. I'm not talking to you.
You don't want to talk, you don't want to give your side of the story as to what happened.
Of course, in Sheila's interview, she continued to deny everything about the homicide of Marlene Warren and any involvement at all in her death.
Okay. You're charged with the first-degree murder, okay, of Marlene Warren.
So it's a huge deal. Sheila is facing the death penalty.
Okay. We're going to go up to the regional jail and process you, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Even with all of this excitement and the momentum of her arrest, things slow way down very quickly. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office evidence room was audited, and auditors found that bags of evidence, including those taken from the crime scene in the clown murder, were left open, just wide open.
We were looking at a box full of evidence that wasn't in really good shape. I'm thinking, oh God, if I was the other lawyer, I'd eat this case apart. You know, so many things were going through my head, you know, that she could just walk.
And then in the midst of that, the COVID pandemic hit, and our courthouse basically shut down for over 2 years. And during that time, we lost a key witness who passed.
Each day that passes, evidence is getting weaker. You've got fewer and fewer witnesses. Sheila had a robust team of defense attorneys who did everything they could to poke holes in the prosecutor's case.
The discussion started coming together about what's our realistic expectation of what we can get out of this crime at this time.
Prosecutors decided not to pursue the death penalty. She could be sentenced to life in prison, but not executed. It got so close to trial that Dave Ehrenberg, the state attorney, was on TV saying, this trial is coming in 2 weeks, and we are so confident that she's going to be convicted.
I had to get to the point and tell myself, no matter how this ends, I have to be good with it. If she walks and doesn't get anything, I got to be good with it.
Finally, the trial is just around the corner, and we get a tip that Sheila is about to plead guilty in less than an hour.
The old school. Yeah, this is a 1990.
No one expected it. I go to the courthouse because we've gotten this tip.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, Ms. Keene Warren witness plea of guilty as outlined in the plea agreement.
The state offered her a pretty remarkable plea deal. She pleads guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 12-year prison sentence, which was just a huge shock.
I would never have entered into this plea agreement unless Joey approved it. The victim is really important to us, and Joe said that he was ready to move on and have some measure of closure.
I couldn't deny it. I wanted a conviction. And so did they. If she was going to do 12 years, let's do the 12 years. She'll pay. One way or another, she'll get what's coming to her.
The whole time Sheila Keene Warren was behind bars, she never let on that she was the clown killer. Michael Warren was in the car with a perfect alibi while this occurred. There was no evidence that Michael participated in the murder of his wife. So we do not have enough to charge him. And if that changes, we'll be ready.
Everybody loved my mom. Nobody disliked her. She was always honest, caring, discerning to everyone that wanted to help themselves. She was very alive. You know, she would always laugh and she would see the good in everything. She taught me how to do that, and that was a blessing.
The first clue was not a fingerprint, a weapon, or a witness hiding in the shadows. It was a confession so enormous that it sounded impossible. An aging prisoner sat across from investigators with little emotion on his face. His voice was steady, almost conversational, as though he were recalling old highways he had once traveled instead of human lives he had taken. One after another, he described women whose names had long disappeared from police files. He remembered the color of a dress, the style of a haircut, a pair of shoes left beside a dirt road, the faded sign outside a neighborhood bar, the weather on the night everything ended. He remembered details that had survived inside his mind for decades, while the rest of the world had forgotten the women themselves. At first, the investigators assumed they were listening to fantasy. Serial killers often exaggerated. They claimed crimes they never committed. They searched for attention, for power, for one final opportunity to manipulate the people trying to understand them. Nothing about 93 murders sounded believable. No one could disappear into the background of American history while leaving behind a trail that long. Then the details began to match. One forgotten homicide after another suddenly found its missing pieces. A body discovered in an empty field in the early 1970s. A woman whose death had quietly been ruled an overdose. Another found near a highway where almost every physical clue had already vanished beneath decades of rain and sunlight. Detectives opened dusty boxes that had not been touched in years. Autopsy photographs were examined again. Old reports, written by officers who had long since retired or passed away, suddenly carried new meaning. The impossible slowly became undeniable. Some of the women had never even been identified. They had been buried beneath simple markers that carried only 2 words. Jane Doe. Others had names, but no one had searched very hard when they disappeared. Some struggled with addiction. Some survived through sex work. Others drifted from city to city, with no permanent address, and no reliable family waiting for them at home. Their disappearances were treated as unfortunate, but unsurprising, another quiet tragedy in neighborhoods already carrying more suffering than anyone seemed willing to notice. For decades, the country moved forward while their stories remained unfinished. The man sitting across the interrogation table claimed he knew how each story ended. His name was Samuel Little. Long before newspapers called him the most prolific serial killer in American history, he had spent years becoming almost invisible. He was arrested countless times for violence, theft, assault, fraud, and other crimes. His fingerprints entered police databases. His face appeared in booking photographs across different states. His criminal record stretched through decades. Yet every time he slipped back onto the streets, another vulnerable woman eventually crossed his path. His murders rarely attracted national headlines. There were no elaborate crime scenes covered in blood. No mysterious letters mailed to newspapers. No dramatic messages carved into walls. There were no complicated puzzles left behind for detectives to solve. Instead, there was silence. Silence inside abandoned lots where bodies rested unnoticed. Silence in police departments overwhelmed by hundreds of open investigations. Silence inside families who had already accepted that no one in authority seemed interested in finding their missing daughters. It was a silence that lasted more than 30 years. America often remembers its infamous killers through sensational headlines. Some became household names because they terrorized wealthy suburbs or targeted college campuses. Television cameras followed every court appearance. Entire books were written before the trials even ended. Samuel Little operated in a different America. His victims lived where cameras rarely pointed. They disappeared from neighborhoods already struggling with poverty, addiction, racism, and neglect. Many had learned early in life that survival depended on staying unnoticed. Ironically, that same invisibility became the weapon that protected the man hunting them. He understood something terrifying about society. Some people could disappear without creating enough noise for anyone to listen. Night after night, city after city, state after state, he drove across thousands of miles of highways connecting America together. Truck stops, small taverns, downtown bars, neglected neighborhoods, forgotten motels, cracked sidewalks illuminated by flickering neon lights. Places where strangers met without asking too many questions. Places where loneliness could become an opportunity. To most people, those highways represented freedom. To Samuel Little, they became hunting grounds. His methods were brutally simple. Simplicity, in many ways, made him more dangerous. He rarely carried weapons. He did not need them. Years spent boxing had taught him exactly how much force the human body could absorb before collapsing. A sudden punch could leave someone dazed or unconscious. Strong hands could accomplish what knives or guns often did while leaving behind far fewer obvious clues. Many of the women showed no dramatic injuries visible to inexperienced investigators. Some deaths appeared accidental. Others seemed consistent with overdoses. A few were simply mysteries that never found answers. Every mistaken conclusion became another layer protecting the killer. Years became decades. The pattern remained hidden because the crimes belonged to different police departments separated by hundreds, or even thousands of miles. One detective in Texas had no reason to connect a forgotten homicide with another investigator's file in California. An unsolved death in Mississippi appeared unrelated to another in Ohio. Before modern DNA databases and advanced information sharing, the system itself struggled to recognize patterns spread across an entire nation. Little understood this long before technology finally caught up. Whether through instinct, experience, or simple observation, he recognized weaknesses inside the criminal justice system. He rarely stayed in one place for long. He blended into transient communities where faces constantly changed. By the time investigators asked questions, he had usually crossed another state line. Every mile created distance. Every passing year erased evidence. Every forgotten victim strengthened his confidence. What makes this story especially unsettling is not simply the number of murders eventually connected to his name. It is the realization that he did not possess extraordinary intelligence in the traditional sense. He was not a criminal mastermind designing elaborate schemes worthy of detective novels. Instead, he exploited ordinary failures. Underfunded police departments. Poor communication between jurisdictions. Social prejudice against women living difficult lives. The limitations of forensic science during the 20th century. Above all, society's willingness to believe that certain victims somehow mattered less than others. Those failures accumulated quietly until they formed one of the darkest chapters in modern American criminal history. Years later, investigators would sit with Samuel Little for countless interviews. Unlike many killers who enjoyed theatrical performances or emotional manipulation, Little often appeared strangely relaxed. His memory drifted effortlessly through time. He described faces that investigators had never seen. He remembered clothing preserved only in faded crime scene photographs. He recalled intersections, abandoned buildings, rivers, highways, and bars that had changed beyond recognition over the decades. Sometimes he even sketched the women. Colored pencils moved carefully across paper, as if he were drawing portraits of old acquaintances, instead of victims whose families had spent years wondering what happened. The faces emerging from those drawings carried expressions of ordinary humanity. They smiled softly. They wore earrings. Their hairstyles reflected the fashion of another era. Looking at them, it became painfully easy to imagine them laughing with friends only hours before their lives ended. For some families, those drawings became the first real clue they had received in decades. Imagine seeing a portrait on the evening news that looks unmistakably like the sister who vanished 40 years earlier. Imagine realizing the man who drew her face was also the one who ended her life. That horrifying possibility became reality for more than one family as investigators worked through Little's astonishing confessions. Even then, not every question found an answer. Many victims remain unidentified today. Some families still have no idea that the missing woman they continue searching for became part of Samuel Little's long trail across America. Some bodies were never found. Others were buried without names. The story therefore refuses to fit neatly into the familiar structure of crime and punishment. There is no single night when evil suddenly appeared, no dramatic chase that ended everything, no heroic detective who solved every mystery before more lives were lost. Instead, this is a story measured in decades. It is a story about forgotten people, whose lives deserved far more attention than they received. It is a story about institutions that sometimes failed those who needed protection the most. And it is a story about one man who recognized those failures and quietly turned them into an opportunity to kill again and again while an entire nation looked somewhere else. Before the confessions, before the courtroom, before investigators began reopening cold cases stretching back to the early 1970s, there was simply another man traveling American highways with no reason for strangers to remember his face. To understand how one individual could hide behind ordinary life for more than 35 years, we must return to the beginning, long before his name became synonymous with one of the largest serial murder investigations in United States history, to a childhood shaped by instability, violence, and neglect, where the first chapters of Samuel Little's life quietly unfolded long before anyone imagined how many others would eventually become part of his story. The story of Samuel Little did not begin with murder. It began in uncertainty, in a world where stability was something other children took for granted, but rarely existed for him. Long before investigators would spend countless hours trying to reconstruct his movements across dozens of states, there was a young boy whose own life lacked direction almost from the moment he entered it. Samuel McDowell was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, during an era when much of the American South was still struggling with poverty, racial segregation, and the lingering effects of the Great Depression. The circumstances surrounding his birth have remained clouded by conflicting accounts. Some records suggest his mother was a teenage sex worker who spent periods of time in jail shortly after his birth. Other accounts paint a slightly different picture, but every version shares one common theme. Samuel entered the world without the kind of secure family foundation that shapes a healthy childhood. Instead of growing up under the steady guidance of devoted parents, he experienced instability almost immediately. Responsibility for raising him eventually fell to his grandmother. While she provided him with a home, that home could never erase the emotional absence left by parents who were largely missing from his life. Children often develop their understanding of trust, empathy, and emotional connection during their earliest years. When those foundations are fractured, the consequences can echo throughout adulthood in unpredictable ways. There is no single event in Samuel Little's childhood that explains the monster he would become. Human behavior is rarely that simple. Millions of children experience poverty, neglect, broken homes, and violence without ever harming another person. His background may help explain certain emotional deficits, but it can never excuse the choices he would later make. The women whose lives he stole deserve to remain at the center of this story, not the suffering of the man who murdered them. Even so, understanding his early years helps reveal how a deeply troubled individual slowly evolved into someone capable of extraordinary violence. As Samuel grew older, those around him noticed a pattern that would continue for decades. Authority meant very little to him. School offered neither discipline nor purpose. He drifted through adolescence with few meaningful relationships and even fewer long-term goals. Instead of building connections, he learned how to survive alone. Instead of respecting rules, he viewed them as temporary obstacles. The neighborhoods where he spent his youth exposed him to violence, instability, and crime. Fights were common. Petty theft was not unusual. For many young people, these surroundings became challenges they struggled to escape. Samuel, however, appeared increasingly comfortable within that environment. Criminal behavior gradually became less of an exception and more of a routine. As he entered adulthood, his physical appearance made him seem unremarkable. He stood of average height, neither especially handsome nor particularly intimidating at first glance. People who later encountered him often described someone who blended easily into crowded streets. He could disappear inside bus stations, bars, truck stops, and neighborhoods without attracting attention. That ordinary appearance would become one of his greatest advantages. Serial killers are often imagined as monsters whose evil can somehow be recognized instantly. Reality is almost always far more disturbing. Samuel Little looked like countless other men traveling America's highways. He worked temporary jobs. He moved frequently. He owned little. He left few lasting impressions. If someone passed him in a grocery store during the late 1970s, they would have seen another ordinary customer pushing a shopping cart. If someone shared a booth with him inside a roadside diner, they likely would have remembered nothing remarkable about the conversation. His danger existed beneath the surface. One aspect of his early adult life would later become critically important. Boxing. Samuel developed considerable experience as an amateur boxer. He was never a famous athlete, nor did he enjoy significant success in professional competition, but the sport taught him something far more valuable than trophies. It taught him how the human body reacts under sudden violence. A trained boxer learns balance, leverage, timing, and precision. Every movement becomes efficient. Every strike serves a purpose. More importantly, boxing teaches exactly where to hit an opponent to create maximum effect with minimum effort. Years later, investigators would come to believe those skills became central to his method of killing. Unlike murderers who relied on firearms or knives, Samuel preferred using his own hands. According to investigators, he often incapacitated victims with a powerful punch before strangling them manually. That approach produced relatively few obvious injuries compared with many other forms of homicide. Without stab wounds or bullet holes, inexperienced investigators sometimes failed to recognize homicide immediately, particularly when victims already struggled with addiction or poor health. His knowledge of violence became frighteningly practical. While boxing gave him physical confidence, the rest of his life continued sliding deeper into criminality. Arrest records accumulated steadily. The charges varied from state to state, but painted an unmistakable picture. Shoplifting, theft, fraud, assault, kidnapping, sexual violence, driving offenses, resisting arrest. The list continued growing year after year. Police departments across America encountered Samuel Little repeatedly, yet almost none of those encounters hinted at the true scale of his future crimes. Sometimes he served short jail sentences. Sometimes charges were dismissed. Sometimes evidence proved insufficient for conviction. Each release returned him to the same roads, where he had already learned how easily he could disappear. One of the most chilling aspects of his criminal history is how ordinary it appeared when viewed one arrest at a time. There was no single conviction that immediately identified him as someone capable of becoming one of the deadliest serial killers in American history. Instead, investigators looking backward would eventually see dozens of warning signs scattered across decades, like puzzle pieces nobody realized belonged together. As America entered the 1960s and 70s, the country itself was changing rapidly. Interstate highways connected cities faster than ever before. Millions of people relocated for work. Truck routes stretched across the nation. Large urban centers expanded while economic inequality deepened in many neighborhoods. These changes created new opportunities, not only for ordinary workers, but also for criminals who preferred mobility over permanence. Samuel embraced that lifestyle completely. He became a drifter. He traveled constantly. One week he might appear in Florida. Months later, he surfaced in Texas. Another arrest placed him in Mississippi. Then Ohio. Then California. Each location represented another temporary chapter, before he moved again. Living without permanent roots meant few people noticed his absence. It also meant few people recognized his arrival. For investigators decades later, reconstructing his movements became almost impossible. Old employment records disappeared. Witnesses died. Businesses closed. Memories faded. Highways remained, but the people who once watched travelers come and go often could no longer remember individual faces. That anonymity protected him. During these years, Samuel developed another disturbing habit. He spent time in bars, nightclubs, and neighborhoods where vulnerable women gathered. Many struggled to survive financially. Some exchanged sex for money. Others battled addiction. Many distrusted law enforcement because of previous arrests or difficult experiences with authorities. These women often lived day to day. Their lives unfolded outside the attention of mainstream society. They were not invisible to one another. They had friends, families, dreams, children, memories. But to much of the wider world, they occupied the margins. Samuel noticed that reality. Investigators would later conclude that he deliberately selected victims who were less likely to generate intensive missing person investigations. It was not random. It reflected a calculated understanding of which disappearances attracted immediate police attention and which quietly slipped into forgotten filing cabinets. Years later, while speaking with investigators, he admitted that he believed nobody cared about the women he targeted. That belief was horrifying. Even more horrifying was how often the system unintentionally proved him correct. Missing person reports were delayed. Bodies remained unidentified. Deaths received limited forensic examination. Files gathered dust. Every investigative failure reinforced his confidence. Yet during those years, no one possessed the complete picture. Police officers investigating a suspicious death in Kentucky knew nothing about another detective examining a similar case in California. An unsolved homicide in Florida remained isolated from another in Tennessee. Communication between jurisdictions existed, but it lacked the technological sophistication available today. National DNA databases had not yet transformed homicide investigations. Digital record systems remained decades away. Samuel drifted through those gaps unnoticed. His criminal history should have raised alarms. Instead, it became background noise. Every arrest focused on the immediate offense. Very few investigators had reason to suspect they were repeatedly encountering someone already responsible for multiple murders. Looking back now, it is tempting to imagine that warning signs should have been obvious. History rarely feels that simple while it is unfolding. Officers handled thousands of suspects. Courts processed endless criminal cases. Resources remained limited. Without modern forensic tools, many investigations depended heavily upon eyewitness testimony and physical evidence that often disappeared long before detectives reached crime scenes. Samuel understood none of the scientific complexities involved. He simply recognized results. He kept getting away. Each successful escape strengthened the illusion that he could continue forever. Confidence slowly replaced caution. The highways became familiar. The bars became familiar. The routine became familiar. Somewhere along those endless roads, a pattern quietly emerged. A lonely woman. A conversation. A ride. Then disappearance. Again. And again. And again. No newspaper, could yet see the pattern. No detective could yet draw lines connecting dozens of forgotten investigations scattered across the American map. But the pattern existed all the same, growing larger with every passing year. Soon, that routine would evolve into one of the longest and most devastating killing sprees the United States had ever unknowingly witnessed, leaving behind victims whose stories would remain buried beneath decades of silence before anyone finally realized they had all crossed paths with the same man. Across America, during the early 1970s, thousands of women woke each morning carrying burdens that rarely appeared in newspapers. Some were trying to recover from addiction. Some were escaping abusive relationships with nowhere permanent to stay. Others had left home years earlier after family conflicts, poverty, or childhood trauma. Many worked nights, because daylight offered few opportunities to earn enough money to survive. Their stories were different, but they shared one painful reality. They lived in places where being overlooked had become part of everyday life. The cities were changing rapidly. Downtown neighborhoods that had once supported thriving businesses were beginning to decline. Factories closed. Jobs disappeared. Entire communities struggled with unemployment and rising crime. In many urban districts, abandoned buildings stood beside busy streets, their broken windows reflecting flashing neon signs from bars that stayed open until dawn. Bus stations welcomed travelers who arrived carrying little more than a single suitcase. Cheap motels rented rooms by the night. Cars rolled slowly through streets where strangers could meet without ever asking each other's last names. For many women, these neighborhoods were not symbols of danger. They were simply home. Some were mothers trying to provide for children while fighting impossible financial odds. Others dreamed of saving enough money to leave and begin again somewhere new. Some hoped to reunite with family members after overcoming addiction. Others wanted nothing more than a stable apartment, steady employment, and a chance to live quietly. Their lives were complicated, but they were not defined by their struggles. They laughed with friends. They celebrated birthdays. They listened to music while getting ready for work. They called sisters, mothers, or children whenever they could. They carried photographs inside worn wallets. They imagined futures that would never arrive. When people discuss serial murder, victims sometimes become statistics. Their names disappear beneath numbers that seem too large to comprehend. 93 confessed murders. Around 60 confirmed. Dozens still under investigation. Numbers can communicate scale, but they cannot express loss. Every woman represented an entire life interrupted, a network of relationships forever altered, and countless ordinary moments that would never happen again. Many of Samuel Little's victims were black women. Others were white or Hispanic. Some struggled with substance abuse. Some survived through sex work, because legitimate employment remained beyond reach. These facts are important, because they explain how systemic prejudice shaped the investigations that followed, but they should never become the entirety of their identities. Each woman existed long before she encountered the man who ended her life. One had once dreamed of becoming a nurse. Another loved dancing on weekends. Another never missed an opportunity to help younger relatives. Another could always make people laugh, even during difficult times. Those personal stories often disappeared from official reports, replaced by clinical descriptions and criminal histories that unintentionally reduce complex human beings to a few typed lines on paper. When one of these women vanished, the response often depended on how society viewed her. Families reported daughters missing. Friends searched familiar neighborhoods. Mothers visited shelters. Sisters called hospitals. Children waited for someone who never returned home. Sometimes police officers worked tirelessly with the limited resources available to them. Detectives knocked on doors, interviewed witnesses, and searched abandoned properties. But in many jurisdictions, during that era, missing adults were frequently assumed to have left voluntarily unless clear evidence suggested otherwise. If the missing person struggled with addiction, lacked a permanent address, or had been arrested before, investigators often faced an uphill battle determining whether a crime had actually occurred. The result was heartbreaking. Critical hours passed. Potential witnesses moved away. Memories faded. Evidence disappeared beneath weather, traffic, and time. When bodies were eventually discovered, they were often found in isolated places where nature had already begun erasing clues. Remote roads, empty fields, wooded areas, riverbanks, construction sites, places that ordinary people rarely visited. Sometimes hikers made the discovery. Sometimes road maintenance crews. Sometimes hunters. Occasionally, the remains were uncovered completely by accident months, or even years later. By then, identifying the victim had become extraordinarily difficult. Modern forensic science had not yet transformed criminal investigations. DNA analysis remained unavailable for much of the period during which Samuel Little committed his crimes. Fingerprints required known records for comparison. Dental identification depended on existing dental files. Many victims had neither. Some carried no identification at all. Medical examiners did their best with the technology available. They carefully documented clothing, jewelry, hair color, estimated age, height, weight, visible injuries. Everything was preserved in reports that investigators hoped might someday lead to identification. Yet hope often faded. Unknown women became Jane Does. Burials took place without families present. Graves received simple markers instead of names. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the country, parents continued waiting for phone calls that would never come. One of the greatest tragedies surrounding this case is that many families never stopped searching. Contrary to common assumptions, not every victim had been abandoned by loved ones. Some relatives contacted police repeatedly. Others traveled between cities following rumors. A few spent years wondering whether their daughters were still alive somewhere, unable to imagine that they had died anonymously hundreds of miles away. Those unanswered questions lasted decades. Every holiday carried another empty chair. Every birthday became another painful reminder. Every unfamiliar phone number brought a brief moment of hope before disappointment returned. The emotional burden extended far beyond the victims themselves. Law enforcement agencies faced challenges that are difficult to appreciate from a modern perspective. During the 1970s and 1980s, police departments largely operated within their own jurisdictions. Information sharing between states was slow. Computers were limited. National databases were incomplete by today's standards. A homicide detective in Los Angeles had little practical reason to compare one unsolved case with another investigation unfolding years later in Tennessee or Florida. Each department saw only a small fragment of a much larger picture. One investigator examined a woman found near an abandoned highway. Another handled a similar case hundreds of miles away. Neither realized they were studying chapters of the same story. Patterns that seem obvious today remained hidden because no single person possessed enough information to recognize them. Even when similarities emerged, they were often explained by circumstance. Women involved in prostitution unfortunately faced elevated risks of violence from many offenders. Drug addiction increased vulnerability to accidental death, as well as homicide. Domestic violence remained widespread. The possibility of a single offender traveling across multiple states and targeting similar victims simply did not become the immediate conclusion in most investigations. As years passed, files accumulated inside evidence rooms. Photographs slowly faded. Paper reports yellowed with age. Boxes were labeled, stored, and eventually forgotten as detectives retired or transferred to new assignments. Cold cases became exactly what their name suggested. Cold. Not because investigators stopped caring, but because there were no new leads to pursue. Families experienced that silence differently. For them, every day remained active. Every unanswered question stayed alive. Some mothers died before learning what happened to their daughters. Some siblings grew old carrying photographs that represented the last known images of loved ones. Children reached adulthood without ever knowing why their mothers disappeared. The absence became part of family history, passed from one generation to the next. Across multiple states, these separate tragedies unfolded independently, connected only by one man whom no one had yet identified. Samuel Little moved almost unnoticed through this landscape. He did not create society's inequalities. He exploited them. He recognized vulnerabilities that already existed and used them with devastating effectiveness. His victims were not random in the true sense of the word. They shared characteristics that made them less visible within systems already strained by limited resources and social prejudice. This uncomfortable reality forces a broader question beyond the crimes themselves. What happens when certain lives receive less attention than others? The answer can be measured not only in failed investigations, but in lost opportunities. A missing person report dismissed too quickly. A homicide classified incorrectly. Evidence that never reached another jurisdiction. Small failures accumulated until they formed enormous consequences. Years later, investigators would describe Samuel Little as a predator who understood these weaknesses almost instinctively. Whether he consciously analyzed law enforcement procedures or simply observed outcomes over time, the result remained the same. He continued offending while confidence grew that he would never be held accountable. Yet beneath that confidence, a hidden record was quietly forming. Every arrest placed his fingerprints somewhere. Every traffic stop generated paperwork. Every encounter with police added another piece to a history that would eventually become impossible to ignore. At the time, however, those pieces remained scattered across the country like pages torn from different books. No one realized they belonged together. The women whose lives had ended in isolated fields, abandoned lots, and forgotten roadsides deserved justice, but justice requires recognition before it can begin. For more than 3 decades, recognition remained painfully out of reach. Still, history has a way of preserving fragments that seem insignificant in the moment. A biological sample carefully stored in an evidence locker. A detective who refused to throw away an old case file. A medical examiner's detailed notes. A fingerprint entered into a database years before anyone understood its importance. Those fragments would survive the passage of time. Decades later, advances in forensic science and the determination of investigators would breathe new life into cases once believed unsolvable, setting in motion the breakthrough that would finally expose one of the longest-running serial murder cases in American history. 4 years. The investigation did not resemble a single case. It resembled dozens of unrelated tragedies unfolding across the United States, each handled by different police departments, different medical examiners, and different prosecutors. There was no command center connecting the evidence, no wall covered with photographs linked by colored strings, and no detective who immediately recognized the same offender moving from state to state. Instead, there were separate files stored in separate buildings, each documenting the loss of one woman whose story seemed isolated from every other. One report described a body discovered along a rural roadside. Another documented remains found behind an abandoned building. Elsewhere, investigators examined a woman recovered from a wooded area after weeks of exposure to the elements. Every case demanded careful attention, yet each unfolded within the limitations of its own jurisdiction. Crime scenes rarely remain frozen in time. Wind carries away trace evidence. Rain washes away footprints. Animals disturb remains. Vehicles pass nearby, unknowingly destroying tire impressions that might have been useful only hours earlier. By the time many of these victims were discovered, the environment itself had become an obstacle. Detectives documented everything they could. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. Clothing was collected and carefully packaged. Jewelry, when present, was preserved in evidence bags. Soil samples were sometimes gathered. Medical examiners searched for injuries that could explain the cause of death. Often, however, the passage of time had already erased crucial answers. Manual strangulation presents particular challenges for investigators, especially when a body has undergone significant decomposition. Obvious signs of violence can become difficult to identify, and without eyewitnesses or additional physical evidence, determining exactly what happened may be extraordinarily complex. During the 1970s and 1980s, forensic science was advancing, but many of the tools that investigators now consider routine either did not exist or were still in their infancy. As a result, some deaths remained suspicious without ever becoming fully understood. Others were classified according to the best available evidence at the time, even though later developments would raise new questions. These were not necessarily failures of individual investigators. They reflected the technological limitations of an earlier era and the enormous challenges faced by departments with limited personnel and resources. Meanwhile, families searched in whatever ways they could. Some visited neighborhoods where their loved ones had last been seen, carrying worn photographs that gradually became creased from repeated handling. They asked store owners, shelter workers, bartenders, and anyone else willing to talk. Every conversation ended with another possibility, but rarely with certainty. Perhaps she had traveled to another city. Perhaps she wanted to start over. Perhaps someone had seen her boarding a bus. Hope often survived, because the alternative was almost unbearable. For families whose relatives struggled with addiction or unstable housing, uncertainty became especially cruel. Long periods without contact were not entirely unusual, making it difficult to determine when concern should become alarm. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, the silence itself became frightening. Across the country, detectives continued doing what investigators always do. They interviewed witnesses, revisited familiar locations, and compared statements looking for inconsistencies. Some cases generated promising leads that ultimately dissolved under closer examination. Individuals who initially appeared suspicious were eliminated after evidence placed them elsewhere. Rumors circulated through neighborhoods, but rarely produced reliable information. Each investigation carried its own frustrations. Someone remembered seeing an unfamiliar car, but could not describe its license plate. Another witness believed they had spoken to the victim shortly before her disappearance, but could not remember the exact date. A bartender recalled an argument inside the establishment, but had no names to offer. Memory is fragile, especially after months or years have passed. The further investigators moved from the day of the crime, the more difficult it became to separate fact from assumption. Some detectives refused to give up. Cold case units, where they existed, periodically reopened unsolved homicides, reviewing old files with fresh eyes. Investigators looked for overlooked details, questioned earlier conclusions, and searched for new forensic techniques that might extract additional information from preserved evidence. Occasionally, those efforts produced important discoveries. More often, they produced only more questions. Throughout these years, Samuel Little himself continued attracting the attention of law enforcement, though not for the murders that would eventually define his criminal history. His name appeared in arrest records involving assault, theft, fraud, narcotics offenses, and other crimes. Officers encountered him in different states under different circumstances. Booking photographs documented the gradual aging of a man who remained remarkably ordinary in appearance. Each arrest represented an opportunity that, in hindsight, feels significant. Yet hindsight possesses information unavailable to those living through events. An officer processing an assault suspect could not reasonably know that investigators hundreds of miles away were examining an unsolved homicide with no obvious connection. Without a shared investigative picture, each encounter remained confined to the immediate offense. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine that one decisive moment could have stopped everything. History rarely unfolds that way. Instead, it advances through countless ordinary decisions made with incomplete information. The women whose cases remained unsolved were not forgotten by everyone. Many detectives carried them quietly throughout their careers. Retired investigators have often spoken about the files that stayed with them long after they left law enforcement. Certain photographs remained difficult to forget. Certain conversations with grieving parents echoed years later. Every unsolved case represented a promise that justice had not yet been achieved. That emotional burden extended beyond investigators. Medical examiners remembered unidentified victims, whose names they never learned. Victim advocates continued supporting families despite having few answers to provide. Community members organized searches, distributed flyers, and refused to let disappearances pass unnoticed. Although these individual efforts rarely made national headlines, they reflected a persistent belief that every victim deserved recognition. As the decades passed, however, another force quietly transformed criminal investigation. Science. Evidence collected years earlier, and stored carefully inside property rooms, acquired new significance as forensic technology advanced. Biological samples once considered too limited for meaningful analysis could now be examined using increasingly sophisticated methods. Laboratories developed techniques capable of extracting information that earlier generations of investigators could scarcely imagine. Across the United States, cold cases began finding new life. Some involved offenders identified through preserved DNA. Others were solved after digital databases allowed investigators from different jurisdictions to recognize patterns that had once remained hidden. The landscape of homicide investigation was changing. Files that had gathered dust for 20 or 30 years suddenly became candidates for renewed examination. Detectives who inherited these old cases brought fresh perspectives. They questioned assumptions that had guided earlier investigations, not because previous detectives had acted carelessly, but because new knowledge made different questions possible. Could biological evidence be tested again? Could unidentified victims be compared against expanding missing person databases? Could separate jurisdictions exchange information more efficiently than before? These developments gradually created possibilities that had never previously existed. Still, no one yet understood the full scale of what lay ahead. The separate investigations remained scattered across numerous states. Individual breakthroughs occurred from time to time, but they did not immediately reveal a nationwide pattern. The hidden connections remained buried beneath decades of geography, bureaucracy, and forgotten records. Then, one development in California would begin altering everything. Investigators examining evidence from several Los Angeles homicide cases dating back to the late 1980s submitted preserved biological material for modern DNA analysis. Advances in forensic science made testing possible in ways that had not existed when the murders originally occurred. The laboratory results identified a common contributor. That finding alone was significant. Even more significant was what happened next. The DNA profile matched a man already known to law enforcement through previous arrests. His name was Samuel Little. For the first time, investigators possessed something tangible that connected him not merely to a history of violent offenses, but to multiple homicides. The discovery did not immediately answer every question. It did not reveal the true number of victims. It did not expose the decades-long patterns stretching across the nation. But it transformed Samuel Little from a repeat offender with an extensive criminal record into the prime suspect in murders supported by modern forensic evidence. After so many years of uncertainty, investigators finally had a thread strong enough to follow. They could not yet see where it would lead. They could not know that pulling on that single thread would eventually unravel one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history, exposing crimes that had remained hidden for more than 3 decades, and giving long overdue attention to victims whose stories had waited patiently for someone to connect them at last. The DNA match did not bring immediate closure. Instead, it opened a door into a labyrinth that investigators had never expected to enter. When detectives in California connected Samuel Little to 3 murders committed in Los Angeles during the late 1980s, they believed they had finally identified a violent offender who had escaped justice for decades. The evidence was strong enough to support prosecution, and after years of uncertainty, there was finally a clear path toward accountability. In 2014, Samuel Little was convicted of murdering 3 women whose cases had remained unsolved for decades. The sentence was 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. For many criminal investigations, that would have marked the end of the story. The offender had been identified. The evidence had been presented. The jury had reached its verdict. Justice, at least within the limits of the law, had been delivered. Yet for a handful of investigators studying Samuel Little's history, something did not feel complete. His criminal record stretched back more than half a century. He had lived in numerous states, traveled constantly, and accumulated arrests for violent offenses long before the Los Angeles murders. Detectives reviewing his background noticed patterns that seemed difficult to dismiss as coincidence. His movements frequently overlapped with unsolved homicides involving vulnerable women. No single coincidence proved anything. Taken together, however, they raised unsettling questions. How many places had he lived? How many women had disappeared while he was nearby? How many investigations had never looked beyond their own county or state? Those questions reached investigators far beyond California. One of the people who became deeply interested in those possibilities was Texas Ranger James Holland. Unlike television detectives, Holland understood that solving old crimes often depended less on dramatic confrontations than on patience. Evidence spoke when people listened carefully enough. Witnesses remembered details when they felt respected rather than pressured. Even offenders sometimes revealed information, though rarely in response to intimidation alone. By the time Holland became involved, Samuel Little was an elderly inmate. Age had changed him. The powerful boxer, who had once traveled the country, had become physically frail. Years of incarceration and declining health had slowed his movements. He spent much of his time inside prison with little expectation of ever leaving. Many investigators had already attempted interviews. Some achieved limited success. Others encountered silence. Little did not appear interested in dramatic confessions or emotional performances. He often refused to engage at all. Holland approached the situation differently. Rather than beginning with accusations, he began with conversation. He spoke about subjects that interested Little. Classic automobiles. Long highway drives. Amateur boxing. Art. The changing landscape of American cities. Hours passed discussing ordinary topics that had little apparent connection to homicide investigations. Trust, if it could be called that, developed gradually. This approach did not excuse Little's crimes or treat him with sympathy. Instead, it reflected an investigative strategy grounded in psychology. People often reveal more when they no longer feel every conversation is a battle. Little slowly became willing to talk. At first, the discussions touched only lightly on the past. Then they became more specific. Eventually, they turned toward women whose disappearances had remained unsolved for decades. What happened next surprised even experienced investigators. Little began recalling individual victims with remarkable detail. Not simply the city. Not merely the approximate year. He described clothing, hairstyles, physical features, cars parked nearby, neighborhood bars, roads he had traveled, the weather, buildings that had since been demolished. His memory appeared unusually precise, especially regarding visual details. Investigators understood that confessions alone could never be accepted at face value. History contains numerous examples of offenders exaggerating their crimes, or falsely claiming responsibility for murders committed by others. Every statement required independent verification. So the work began. Interview transcripts were compared against archived police reports. Old homicide files came out of storage. Medical examiner records were reviewed. Missing person investigations were reopened. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions exchanged information that had never previously been considered together. Sometimes Little described a location where investigators had indeed recovered a woman's body decades earlier. Sometimes he remembered distinctive clothing that matched preserved evidence. In other instances, he accurately recalled circumstances that had never been released publicly. Each confirmed detail strengthened confidence in the broader picture. The investigation expanded. What had started as 3 California murders slowly evolved into a nationwide effort involving federal, state, and local agencies. The scale became extraordinary. Investigators contacted departments across the country asking a question few had ever expected to hear. Could one man be responsible for dozens of your unsolved homicide cases? The answer was not immediate. Every potential match required painstaking examination. Records had to be located. Evidence had to be evaluated. Witness statements needed review. Some original investigators had already retired. Others had passed away. Entire police departments had changed leadership multiple times since the crimes occurred. Finding old files sometimes proved almost as difficult as solving the cases themselves. Meanwhile, Little continued talking. He did not provide information in chronological order. Memories surfaced unpredictably. One interview focused on Texas. Another shifted to Florida. The next wandered toward Ohio or Mississippi. Investigators learned to follow wherever his recollections led, carefully documenting every name, location, and description. Not every statement could be verified. Time had destroyed some evidence permanently. Bodies had never been found in certain cases. Records had disappeared. Even so, many accounts aligned with remarkable accuracy. The growing list forced investigators to confront a painful reality. The women connected to these cases had often lived on the margins of society, and that fact had profoundly shaped the original investigations. Some struggled with addiction. Some lacked stable housing. Some survived through sex work. Others moved frequently between cities. Their circumstances never diminished the value of their lives, yet those circumstances often complicated missing person investigations and victim identification. Recognizing that history became an essential part of the renewed investigation, detectives increasingly emphasized identifying victims as individuals rather than viewing them solely through the circumstances of their deaths. Families who had waited decades for answers were contacted whenever evidence permitted. Those conversations were never easy. Imagine receiving a phone call about a sister who disappeared 40 years earlier. Imagine believing, for decades, that uncertainty itself was the hardest burden to carry. Then imagine learning that investigators finally believed they knew what had happened. Closure, when it came, often arrived alongside renewed grief. Some relatives expressed relief that the waiting had ended. Others struggled with anger that justice had taken so long. Many experienced both emotions simultaneously. As investigators continued reviewing Little's interviews, another remarkable aspect of his recollections emerged. He drew faces. Using colored pencils while incarcerated, he created portraits of women he claimed to remember. The drawings were not courtroom sketches or polished works of art. They were attempts to recreate memories that had remained with him for decades. Investigators recognized an unexpected opportunity. Some victims still lacked names. If the portraits resembled real individuals closely enough, perhaps surviving relatives, former friends, or community members might recognize them. The drawings were eventually released publicly as part of broader identification efforts. For several families, they became the first meaningful lead in years. The images could not replace forensic evidence. They could not establish guilt on their own. But they helped direct attention toward unidentified victims whose stories had remained unfinished. As more information emerged, the Federal Bureau of Investigation became increasingly involved in coordinating efforts among jurisdictions. Cases once viewed as isolated tragedies were now examined within a national context. Analysts compared timelines, travel routes, arrest histories, geographic patterns. Every confirmed victim expanded understanding not only of Samuel Little's crimes, but also of the investigative challenges that had allowed those crimes to remain hidden for so long. The work remained painstaking. Every conclusion demanded evidence. Every identification required careful verification. Investigators understood that accuracy mattered as much as speed. Many of the families had already waited decades. They deserved certainty whenever certainty was possible. By this stage, the investigation had grown far beyond the prosecution of a single offender. It had become an effort to restore names to unidentified victims, to reconnect families with long-missing relatives, and to re-examine assumptions that had shaped unsolved homicide investigations for generations. The conviction in California had provided accountability for 3 murders. The interviews that followed revealed something far larger. A nationwide search for truth was now underway, one that would eventually span dozens of states, challenge long-held investigative conclusions, and reshape the historical understanding of one of the most extensive serial murder investigations in the history of the United States. As investigators worked through Samuel Little's interviews, the investigation entered an entirely different phase. Finding a suspect was no longer the greatest challenge. The challenge now was finding the victims. For decades, law enforcement had searched for a killer without realizing they were often searching for people whose identities had never been established. In many cases, investigators possessed skeletal remains, faded photographs from crime scenes, and aging evidence boxes stored in climate-controlled warehouses. What they did not possess was a name. A name changes everything. Without one, there is no family to notify. No childhood photographs. No school records. No birthdays remembered every year. No one to describe the way a person laughed, the songs they enjoyed, or the dreams they once carried. An unidentified victim exists within the legal system, but remains absent from history. That realization became one of the driving forces behind the renewed investigation. Samuel Little's confessions offered detectives something they had lacked for years: starting points. He frequently remembered where he met a woman, what she looked like, approximately when the encounter occurred, and where he believed he had left her body. Those details were often imperfect. Human memory changes over time, especially across several decades. Roads are renamed. Buildings disappear. Empty fields become shopping centers. Rural highways are widened or rerouted. Investigators therefore treated every recollection as information to be tested rather than accepted automatically. Maps from the 1970s and 1980s were retrieved. Historic aerial photographs helped reconstruct neighborhoods that no longer existed. Retired officers were contacted because they remembered landscapes that younger detectives had never seen. Sometimes an elderly investigator could identify an abandoned nightclub mentioned during an interview even though the building had been demolished 20 years earlier. Those fragments of memory became unexpectedly valuable. One detective might recognize an old motel from a faded description. Another remembered a bridge replaced long ago. Someone else recalled a dirt road that no longer appeared on modern maps. The investigation became as much an exercise in historical reconstruction as criminal investigation. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing. Evidence collected decades earlier could now undergo testing unimaginable when the crimes occurred. Laboratories revisited preserved biological samples. Missing person databases expanded. Dental records, fingerprints, and DNA profiles were compared across jurisdictions with far greater speed than previous generations could have imagined. Each technological advance increased the possibility that another unidentified victim might finally recover her name. Some successes arrived quietly. An unidentified woman buried for decades was matched to a missing person report submitted years earlier by relatives who had never stopped searching. Elsewhere, genetic genealogy began contributing to cases where traditional identification methods had failed. By comparing DNA with extended family members, investigators slowly reconstructed family trees leading toward victims whose identities had been lost to time. These breakthroughs did not occur overnight. Months of laboratory work often produced only one meaningful lead. Even then, additional verification remained essential. Every identification represented countless hours of careful scientific analysis, combined with traditional detective work. For the families involved, however, those hours transformed decades of uncertainty into long-awaited answers. Some relatives learned that investigators had finally identified a sister missing since the early 1980s. Others discovered that a daughter long believed to have voluntarily disappeared had instead become the victim of homicide. The emotional impact varied from family to family. There was grief. There was relief. There was anger that so many years had passed before the truth emerged. There was gratitude toward investigators who refused to let forgotten cases remain forgotten. Many families described experiencing two losses instead of one. The first occurred when their loved one disappeared. The second came decades later, when certainty replaced hope. For investigators, every confirmed identification reinforced an uncomfortable truth. Many original investigations had been shaped not only by technological limitations, but also by assumptions about the victims themselves. If someone struggled with addiction, their disappearance sometimes attracted less urgency. If someone had no permanent address, locating them became more complicated. If someone had previous arrests, investigators occasionally faced skepticism from witnesses who assumed the individual had simply moved elsewhere. These challenges were real, but they also exposed broader societal issues that extended far beyond one criminal case. Modern investigators examining Little's crimes frequently emphasized that every victim deserved the same commitment regardless of occupation, housing status, race, or personal circumstances. That principle became increasingly important as agencies revisited old files. The investigation also revealed how dramatically criminal justice had changed over the decades. Today, investigators routinely share information through national databases. DNA profiles can be compared across jurisdictions within hours. Digital records allow detectives in different states to identify similarities that once remained hidden inside paper filing systems. None of those advances could erase the suffering experienced by victims and their families. They could, however, reduce the likelihood that similar patterns would remain undetected for as long in the future. As public awareness grew, the Federal Bureau of Investigation released additional information related to Samuel Little's confessions. This included descriptions of unidentified victims and portraits Little had drawn from memory while incarcerated. The decision reflected a practical investigative strategy rather than sensationalism. Someone, somewhere, might recognize a hairstyle, a pair of distinctive glasses, a favorite outfit, a familiar smile. Recognition sometimes came from unexpected places. Former classmates, neighbors, extended relatives, old friends who had not seen one another for decades. Even a small memory could direct investigators toward records that ultimately established a victim's identity. Every successful identification represented more than an investigative achievement. It restored individuality to someone who had been reduced to a case number. Instead of Jane Doe, investigators could speak a real name. Families could visit graves bearing proper markers. Death certificates could be corrected. Historical records became more complete. Although these actions could never undo the crimes, they acknowledged a truth that had too often been overlooked: every victim mattered. Throughout this process, detectives remained careful when evaluating Samuel Little's statements. Confessions alone were never considered sufficient proof. Investigators sought independent corroboration whenever possible. Did his timeline match documented travel records? Did crime scene evidence support his description? Did medical findings align with the manner of death he described? Could witnesses confirm his presence in the relevant area? This disciplined approach strengthened confidence in confirmed cases while preventing unsupported conclusions. Not every confession could be verified. Some lacked sufficient surviving evidence. Others involved victims who have yet to be identified. As a result, although Little confessed to 93 killings, investigators have publicly stated that many confessions appeared credible while continuing to distinguish between confessed, confirmed, and unresolved cases. That distinction remains important. Accuracy honors both the victims and the integrity of the investigation. By now, the scale of the inquiry had become unprecedented. Detectives from numerous states exchanged information that would once have remained isolated. Cold case specialists, forensic scientists, prosecutors, medical examiners, victim advocates, and federal analysts all contributed to different aspects of the effort. It was no longer simply the investigation of one offender. It had evolved into one of the largest coordinated cold case reviews in modern American history. Yet even after years of progress, unanswered questions remained. Several victims have never been identified. Some families still do not know that their missing relatives' case may be connected to Samuel Little. Other disappearances continue to be evaluated as evidence emerges. The investigation therefore remains, in some respects, unfinished. Its legacy extends beyond courtrooms and prison sentences. It has prompted renewed discussion about how missing person cases are prioritized, how information is shared among jurisdictions, and how vulnerable populations are protected. Perhaps its most enduring lesson concerns visibility. The women targeted by Samuel Little were never invisible to those who loved them. They became invisible within systems that lacked the tools, resources, or perspective to connect their stories. The renewed investigation sought not only to identify a killer, but also to correct that historical failure by ensuring that every possible victim received the attention denied to them for so many years. As the evidence continued to accumulate, prosecutors and investigators faced the final challenge of the case. Samuel Little had already received life sentences and would never leave prison. The remaining question was no longer whether he would regain his freedom. It was how history would remember the women whose lives had been taken, and whether the justice system could restore, even in part, the dignity and recognition they had been denied for decades. By the time the investigation reached its later stages, Samuel Little was no longer a man capable of disappearing onto another highway. He remained behind prison walls, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. His health had steadily declined, and age had transformed the once mobile drifter into an elderly inmate whose world had been reduced to hospital visits, interviews with investigators, and the confines of the correctional system. For many observers, it raised a difficult question. If he was already sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, why continue investigating crimes that had occurred 30 or 40 years earlier? The answer had very little to do with Samuel Little. It had everything to do with the victims. Justice is often imagined as the moment a guilty verdict is read aloud in a courtroom. In reality, justice can also mean identifying someone who was buried without a name. It can mean giving a family an answer after decades of uncertainty. It can mean correcting an official record that mistakenly classified a homicide as an accidental death. Those forms of justice arrive quietly. They rarely generate dramatic headlines. Yet for the families involved, they can matter as much as any prison sentence. Across the country, investigators continued reviewing Little's confessions one by one. Every case demanded its own careful examination. Detectives refused to rely solely on his recollections. They searched for physical evidence, historical records, witness statements, and forensic findings that could independently support his claims. Sometimes confirmation arrived through preserved DNA evidence. Sometimes through crime scene photographs that matched details only the perpetrator was likely to know. Sometimes through travel records, arrest histories, or timelines placing Little in the same city during the relevant period. In other investigations, confirmation remained impossible. Evidence had been lost. Witnesses had died. Entire files had disappeared over the passage of decades. The absence of confirmation did not necessarily prove a confession false, nor did it automatically establish it as true. Investigators remained committed to distinguishing between verified facts and information that could not be conclusively resolved. That careful approach became essential to preserving the credibility of the investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation continued coordinating information among numerous jurisdictions, encouraging local agencies to compare their unsolved homicide cases with the growing body of evidence connected to Little. Maps illustrating the locations of confirmed and suspected victims gradually revealed the extraordinary geographic scope of the investigation. From California to Florida. From Texas to Ohio. From Kentucky to Mississippi. From Louisiana to Arizona. The crime stretched across thousands of miles and more than 3 decades. Few criminal investigations in American history had required coordination on such a scale. Yet even as the map expanded, investigators remained focused on individual lives rather than statistics. Each newly confirmed victim represented a woman whose disappearance had once seemed isolated. A daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend. Someone who had existed long before becoming part of a homicide investigation. Victim advocates worked closely with surviving relatives whenever new identifications were made. These conversations demanded extraordinary sensitivity. Many families had spent decades constructing lives around uncertainty. Some had continued hoping their loved one might still be alive somewhere. Others believed they already knew the truth, but lacked official confirmation. Receiving definitive answers often reopened emotional wounds that had never fully healed. Grief does not disappear simply because many years have passed. In some cases, parents had already died before learning what happened to their daughters. Siblings became the remaining custodians of family memory. Children who had grown up without their mothers now found themselves reading investigative reports describing events that occurred before they were old enough to remember. The passage of time had not diminished the importance of the truth. If anything, it had made that truth even more precious. One particularly significant aspect of the investigation involved the portraits Samuel Little created while incarcerated. Using colored pencils, he drew women he claimed to remember decades after their deaths. Investigators understood that these drawings were not evidence of guilt by themselves. Instead, they became investigative tools. The FBI publicly released many of the portraits, hoping that someone might recognize a familiar face. The response demonstrated the remarkable power of memory. Community members contacted investigators. Families compared the drawings with old photographs. Former classmates and neighbors offered possible identifications. Not every lead proved accurate. Some did. Each successful identification restored part of a person's history that had nearly vanished forever. The portraits also served another purpose. They reminded the public that the victims were individuals, not anonymous figures within a criminal case. Each face reflected an ordinary human life interrupted. As these efforts continued, law enforcement agencies increasingly viewed the Samuel Little investigation as an opportunity to improve future homicide investigations. Training programs emphasized the importance of information sharing between jurisdictions. Cold case units expanded their use of forensic genealogy and modern DNA analysis. Departments reviewed policies regarding unidentified remains and long-term missing person investigations. Although no reform could erase the suffering already endured, investigators hoped the lessons learned might prevent similar failures from recurring. Little himself continued speaking with investigators for a period, though his declining health gradually limited the interviews. He remained capable of recalling remarkable visual details, but not every memory could be fully explored before his condition worsened. Some questions would remain unanswered. Some potential victims might never be identified. Some crimes might never be confirmed to the standard required by investigators. That reality reflected the unavoidable consequences of time. Evidence cannot always survive for half a century. Neither can every witness. Nevertheless, the investigation achieved something extraordinary. Cases once considered permanently unsolved returned to active examination. Families received long-awaited answers. Victims recovered their names. Communities confronted histories that had too often overlooked those living at society's margins. The investigation also prompted broader conversations about whose disappearances receive immediate attention and whose do not. Many experts pointed to the importance of treating every missing person report with equal seriousness, regardless of occupation, race, socioeconomic status, or previous criminal history. The value of a human life does not depend upon public perception. That principle became one of the enduring legacies of the case. By late 2020, Samuel Little's health had deteriorated significantly. He remained incarcerated within the California prison system, serving multiple life sentences. On December 30, 2020, he died at the age of 80 from ongoing medical complications while still in custody. His death ended any possibility of further interviews. It also ensured that certain questions would never receive complete answers. Investigators had already documented an extraordinary number of confessions, but there remained cases requiring additional verification and victims whose identities were still unknown. Those investigations did not end with his death. Evidence continued to be reviewed. Families continued to come forward. Forensic laboratories continued examining preserved samples using advancing technologies. Even today, agencies periodically announce new identifications connected to historical cases, demonstrating that the pursuit of truth can continue long after an offender is gone. In that sense, Samuel Little's death did not conclude the investigation. It merely shifted its focus entirely toward the victims. Without the possibility of additional interviews, investigators concentrated on the evidence already collected and the unanswered questions still waiting inside cold case files. The story that began with an elderly prisoner's astonishing confessions ultimately became something much larger than the biography of a serial killer. It became an examination of the criminal justice system, forensic science, institutional learning, and the enduring determination of investigators who refused to abandon people the world had too often forgotten. Most importantly, it became a reminder that every unidentified victim is more than a case number. Behind every evidence file lies a family. Behind every missing person report lies a life. And behind every successful identification lies the restoration of a name that should never have been lost. With the investigations continuing even after Little's death, the final chapter would not belong to the man responsible for so much suffering. Instead, it would belong to the women whose stories were finally being told, the families who at last received answers, and the lessons that continue to shape homicide investigations across the United States today. The story of Samuel Little is often introduced with a number. 93. It is a number that immediately captures attention because it challenges belief. Few people can comprehend a crime committed on such a scale by a single individual while remaining largely undetected for more than 3 decades. Yet numbers, no matter how extraordinary, can also obscure the people they represent. Behind every confirmed victim was an unfinished life. Behind every unidentified woman was a family history interrupted. Behind every unsolved case was an investigator who eventually had to place another file back on the shelf, knowing that answers had not yet been found. When historians look back on the Samuel Little investigation, they will undoubtedly recognize it as one of the largest serial homicide investigations in the history of the United States. Just as importantly, however, they may view it as a turning point in how law enforcement approaches missing persons, unidentified remains, and long-forgotten homicide cases. The investigation exposed weaknesses that had developed over decades rather than overnight. Many of those weaknesses reflected the era in which the crimes occurred. During the 1970s and much of the 1980s, police departments often relied on paper records stored inside filing cabinets. Information sharing between jurisdictions required letters, telephone calls, or physical copies of reports sent through the mail. A detective in one state might never learn that investigators hundreds of miles away were facing remarkably similar circumstances. Today, that landscape has changed dramatically. National databases allow agencies to compare fingerprints, DNA profiles, missing person records, and unidentified remains far more efficiently than previous generations could imagine. Cold case investigators routinely collaborate across county and state lines. Digital records can be searched within minutes rather than weeks. These advances cannot undo the past. They can, however, reduce the likelihood that patterns spanning multiple jurisdictions will remain hidden for decades. Another lasting lesson involves forensic science itself. Several of the cases connected to Samuel Little remained unsolved not because investigators lacked commitment, but because the available technology simply could not answer the questions they faced. Evidence collected carefully in the 1980s eventually became decisive many years later, because laboratories had developed entirely new methods of analysis. This reality underscores the importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate answers seem impossible. A biological sample that appears insignificant today may become crucial evidence tomorrow. A carefully documented crime scene may solve a case decades later. Every detail matters. The investigation also highlighted the extraordinary value of cold case units. For many years, unsolved homicide files were sometimes viewed as investigations with little realistic chance of resolution. Modern experience has demonstrated the opposite. Cold cases often benefit from fresh perspectives. New detectives ask different questions. Emerging technologies reveal information previously hidden. Witnesses who once feared speaking may eventually come forward. Historical assumptions can be challenged. The Samuel Little investigation became one of the clearest examples of why unsolved cases deserve continued attention, regardless of how much time has passed. Perhaps the most profound lesson, however, concerns the victims themselves. Many women targeted by Little lived in circumstances that made them especially vulnerable. Some struggled with addiction. Some experienced homelessness. Some engaged in sex work. Some had prior contact with the criminal justice system. For too long, those circumstances sometimes influenced how disappearances were perceived by society. The renewed investigation emphasized a different principle. A person's vulnerability increases the need for protection. It does not diminish their worth. Every victim deserved the same determination, the same careful investigation, and the same commitment to justice. That message has resonated well beyond this single case. Victim advocates, criminologists, prosecutors, and law enforcement professionals have increasingly stressed the importance of equitable investigations regardless of a victim's background. Families have also played an essential role in shaping the case's legacy. Many never stopped searching despite the passing decades. Some continued reporting new information whenever memories surfaced. Others preserved photographs, letters, or personal belongings that eventually assisted investigators. Their persistence ensured that many victims were never completely forgotten, even when official investigations reached temporary dead ends. Forensic genealogy has further expanded the possibilities for identifying previously unknown victims. By combining traditional detective work with advances in DNA analysis, investigators continue identifying individuals whose names were once considered permanently lost. Several historical cases across the United States have been solved through these methods, offering hope that additional unidentified victims connected to Samuel Little may eventually be recognized. That possibility remains important because the investigation is not entirely complete. Although Little confessed to 93 killings, investigators continue distinguishing between confessed, confirmed, and unresolved cases based upon available evidence. Some confessions have been strongly corroborated through independent investigation. Others remain under review because surviving evidence is insufficient to reach definitive conclusions. Maintaining that distinction reflects the careful standards expected within modern criminal investigations. Accuracy remains essential, even when the suspect is no longer alive. Samuel Little died in prison in December 2020. His death closed one chapter, but not the larger story. Investigators continue reviewing evidence. Cold case units continue pursuing identifications. Families continue receiving answers. Each new confirmation serves as another reminder that justice sometimes advances slowly but remains worth pursuing. The broader public response to the case has also evolved over time. Rather than focusing exclusively on the offender, many documentaries, books, and educational programs now emphasize the lives of the victims and the systemic lessons revealed by the investigation. That shift reflects a growing recognition that true crime should inform rather than sensationalize. Understanding how investigative systems succeed and fail may help prevent future tragedies. Remembering victims restores dignity that violence attempted to erase. The Samuel Little investigation, therefore, occupies a unique place in criminal justice history. It demonstrated both the limitations and the resilience of investigative institutions. It revealed painful failures while also showcasing remarkable perseverance from detectives, forensic scientists, victim advocates, prosecutors, and families who refused to abandon hope. No single breakthrough solved the case. Instead, progress resulted from thousands of individual efforts accumulated over many years. A laboratory technician preserving biological evidence. A detective reopening an old file. A ranger patiently building conversations instead of demanding confessions. A medical examiner carefully documenting injuries decades earlier. A family refusing to stop asking questions. Each contribution mattered. Together, they transformed scattered tragedies into a clearer historical record. Perhaps the greatest measure of this investigation is not the number associated with Samuel Little's crimes. It is the number of names restored. The number of families finally given answers. The number of unidentified victims who recovered their identities after decades of silence. Justice, in this case, did not arrive all at once. It arrived gradually, case by case, family by family, name by name. That process continues even today. As long as unidentified victims remain, investigators continue searching. As long as unanswered questions survive, cold case files remain open. And as long as those efforts continue, the final legacy of this investigation will belong not to the man whose crimes shocked the nation, but to the enduring commitment to remember the women whose lives deserved to be seen, whose disappearances deserved to be investigated, and whose stories now stand as a lasting reminder that every victim matters equally under the law and in history. Nearly every major criminal investigation leaves behind evidence. Photographs. Court records. Laboratory reports. Boxes filled with documents that eventually become part of an archive. The Samuel Little investigation left behind something else as well. It left behind questions that continue to challenge investigators, criminologists, prosecutors, victim advocates, and society itself. How could one offender travel across so many states for decades without being recognized? Why were so many victims unidentified for so long? What changes have been made to reduce the likelihood of similar failures occurring again? These questions extend far beyond the biography of a single offender. They concern the evolution of the criminal justice system and the responsibility of society to protect those who are most vulnerable. One of the clearest lessons involves communication. Today, information moves between agencies far more efficiently than it did during the years when Little committed his crimes. National databases allow investigators to compare fingerprints, DNA profiles, missing person reports, unidentified remains, and criminal histories across jurisdictions. Analysts can identify patterns that once remained invisible because relevant information was scattered among dozens of departments. Technology, however, is only one part of the solution. Equally important is the willingness to ask broader questions. Could a homicide in one state be connected to another hundreds of miles away? Could an unidentified victim match a missing person report filed years earlier in another jurisdiction? Could similarities that appear coincidental actually represent part of a larger pattern? Modern investigators are increasingly encouraged to think beyond geographic boundaries. The Samuel Little investigation reinforced the importance of that approach. Another enduring lesson concerns evidence preservation. Many of the breakthroughs achieved during the investigation depended upon decisions made decades earlier by people who could not possibly have anticipated future technological advances. Crime scene technicians carefully collected biological samples. Medical examiners documented injuries in detail. Detectives preserved clothing, photographs, and reports even when immediate investigative opportunities seemed limited. Those decisions proved invaluable years later. Without properly preserved evidence, modern DNA analysis could not have established several critical connections. The investigation also demonstrated the remarkable importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. Detectives alone could not solve every aspect of the case. Neither could forensic scientists, nor prosecutors, nor victim advocates. Progress resulted from collaboration. Laboratories analyzed evidence. Historians reconstructed neighborhoods that had changed over time. Analysts compared investigative records across multiple states. Victim specialists communicated with families. Artists and forensic professionals evaluated the portraits Little created while incarcerated. Each discipline contributed unique expertise. The resulting investigation became far stronger than any single agency could have achieved independently. Educational institutions have also examined the case. Criminologists study it when discussing serial offending across multiple jurisdictions. Forensic science programs analyze the evidentiary developments that eventually connected decades-old crimes. Law enforcement academies use aspects of the investigation to illustrate the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining thorough documentation, and sharing information between agencies. In this way, the case has become part of professional training for future investigators. Perhaps the most significant legacy, however, lies outside classrooms and police departments. It lies with the families. For many relatives, the passage of time did not erase grief. Some waited 30 or 40 years before receiving official confirmation regarding what had happened to someone they loved. Others continue waiting today. Their experiences remind us that homicide investigations do not end when public attention fades. Families carry unanswered questions every day. They celebrate birthdays without those who are missing. They gather for holidays while wondering who should have been sitting at the table. They preserve photographs that become increasingly precious with every passing year. Time changes many things. It does not eliminate love. Nor does it erase loss. Several organizations that support families of missing persons have pointed to investigations like this one as evidence that cold cases should never be viewed as hopeless. Scientific advances continue. Databases expand. New witnesses occasionally come forward. Historical records once believed lost are sometimes rediscovered. Even after decades, meaningful progress remains possible. That perspective has encouraged renewed efforts to examine unidentified human remains throughout the United States. Every successful identification demonstrates that persistence can overcome extraordinary obstacles. The case also reminds us to examine language carefully. Historically, victims were sometimes described primarily through their vulnerabilities. They were identified as drug users, as sex workers, as homeless individuals, as people with criminal records. Those descriptions may provide relevant investigative context, but they should never replace identity. Each victim had a name, a family, friends, memories, interests, personal ambitions. Modern victim-centered investigative practices increasingly emphasize presenting people as complete human beings rather than reducing them to the circumstances surrounding their deaths. That shift represents one of the most meaningful cultural changes to emerge from cases like this. The portraits released during the investigation reinforced that idea. Although created by the offender, they ultimately served a different purpose. They encouraged the public to see faces rather than statistics. Some viewers recognized loved ones. Others simply recognized shared humanity. A smile preserved in colored pencil became enough to remind people that every victim once lived an ordinary life before violence interrupted it. As years continue to pass, additional identifications remain possible. Advances in forensic genealogy have already transformed numerous historical investigations across the United States. Investigators continue comparing DNA profiles, reviewing missing person reports, and evaluating information connected to unidentified victims. While not every question will receive an answer, the commitment to continue searching reflects an important principle. Justice is not measured only by convictions. It is also measured by effort. By refusing to abandon unanswered cases. By continuing to seek names for unidentified victims. By acknowledging historical shortcomings and working to improve future investigations. Samuel Little's crimes exposed painful weaknesses within investigative systems of the past. The response that followed demonstrated something equally important. Institutions can learn. Methods can improve. Technology can evolve. Most importantly, priorities can change. Today, many law enforcement agencies place greater emphasis on coordinated investigations, victim identification, and long-term review of unsolved cases precisely because experience has demonstrated the consequences of failing to do so. The story therefore carries both tragedy and hope. The tragedy belongs to the women whose lives ended far too soon, and to the families forced to endure decades of uncertainty. The hope lies in the determination of those who continued searching long, after others believed the answers had disappeared forever. History cannot be rewritten. The victims cannot be returned to the people who loved them. Those realities remain permanent. What can change is how future investigations are conducted. How evidence is preserved. How information is shared. How vulnerable communities are protected. How every missing person is treated with equal urgency and dignity. Those changes represent the most meaningful response to crimes of this magnitude. When people remember the Samuel Little investigation years from now, the astonishing number of confessed murders will undoubtedly remain part of the historical record. But numbers alone should never define the legacy of the case. The true legacy belongs to the investigators who reopened forgotten files. To the forensic scientists who extracted answers from decades-old evidence. To the advocates who stood beside grieving families. To the relatives who refused to stop searching. And above all, to the women whose names, identities, and stories gradually emerged from years of silence. Their lives were always worth remembering. Their disappearances always deserved attention. Their families always deserved answers. The investigation, although unable to undo the past, helped restore something violence had attempted to erase: recognition. In the end, that recognition may be the most enduring form of justice the case could offer.